My parents instructed my brother to take my house because I lacked a family. As a single man in my early 30s, I find myself in a challenging situation. My younger brother, who is 29, has already welcomed 4 children into the world. He became a father at 22, and the kids came in quick succession, one after another, with the latest edition arriving just a couple of months ago. Whether you're here to unwind, get inspired, or simply enjoy a good story, we're so glad you're spending your time with us today. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's tale. The relationship I have with my sister-in-law is strained at best. She often tries to provoke me with her superior attitude, only to switch to a dramatic victim role whenever I respond. If I dare to retaliate, she can cry on cue, garnering sympathy from anyone nearby. My parents and brother adore her, despite being fully aware of her true nature, which they choose to ignore. While I can acknowledge that she is attractive, her personality is so off-putting that I could never find her appealing. She has a college degree but refuses to work, relying entirely on my brother's income. This dependency means they can only afford to live with my parents, leading to a lack of privacy in their cramped 3-bedroom home built in the 1960s. Throughout our childhood, my younger brother was clearly the favorite. Although we were only 3 years apart, he developed a superiority complex, knowing that I faced severe consequences if I ever retaliated against his antics. It was evident that my parents favored him, showering him with gifts and attention unless family members pointed it out, which happened often enough to warrant a move 150 miles away. This relocation meant we only saw our extended family during holidays, as the drive was 3 hours long. My brother's behavior escalated to physical abuse on several occasions, and he relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend, ultimately causing our breakup. Whenever I expressed my feelings about these incidents, my parents simply told me to toughen up. I only received equal treatment when my parents wanted to maintain appearances. It was amusing to see their reactions when they had to treat me the same as my brother during family gatherings. Our relatives, who loved to gossip, often called out my parents for their favoritism, prompting them to move us away to avoid scrutiny. When I turned 18 and moved out, my parents celebrated, relieved they no longer had to support me. I left before finishing high school, opting for couch surfing over living with them. Since then, I've maintained low contact with my family. They didn't even attend my graduation, but I was indifferent to their absence from that point on. I only saw my parents and brother during holidays, just like the rest of the family. The onset of the 2020 pandemic hit me hard. I lost my job and couldn't renew my condo lease because my roommate also lost his job. We were unable to afford the rent on unemployment benefits alone, and I cherished that 2-bedroom condo as my lease ended. My roommate moved back in with relatives, forcing me to sell most of my belongings to avoid homelessness. I regretted renting such an expensive place, realizing too late that I should have chosen a more affordable option to save money for emergencies. That I devised a plan. I owned a truck, which I loved, and found a $1,000 camper in good condition to live in temporarily. However, I ended up living in it far longer than anticipated. I initially hoped to park it at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still lived. When I asked my parents if I could stay for a while, they claimed their house was full and didn't want me there. Given our rocky relationship over the past decade, they insisted I could only park my camper there if I paid them nearly the same amount as renting an apartment, which was exorbitant for just parking. Jobless and trying to save my unemployment benefits, I realized I might as well rent an apartment for that price. My parents referred to my camper as an eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't reach an agreement. My sister-in-law found my situation amusing, mocking me for living in a camper. My brother joined in, calling me a homeless bum. On my first night without a place to stay, I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot, feeling terrified that someone might break in. Unsurprisingly, I didn't sleep well that night and I had no other options. Relatives with houses lived far away, and all my friends were apartment dwellers. I was attached to my area and didn't want to leave. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, which was the only way to receive it. Finding a stable parking spot was challenging. I searched for jobs similar to my previous one, but it took months of living the nomadic camper life. During that time, I encountered various challenges, from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone claimed to be from the HOA and demanded I move. I wasn't parked on a street with houses, and when I questioned their authority, they became belligerent and threatened me. To avoid trouble, I moved my camper to maintain a steady electricity supply. I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This involved sneaking around and plugging into random buildings while parked on the street. I know it's not ideal, but I needed to keep my refrigerator running after months of living this way. I finally secured a new job. I had to relocate to a neighboring city to find work outside of retail, which I had vowed never to do again after my college experience. I was still receiving unemployment benefits but lacked a stable place to live, boredom set in, and I had little to occupy my time aside from reading, watching movies on a portable DVD player, and keeping track of where I could park and find public restrooms. I envied the Japanese public bathhouses. We could use more of those here when I finally landed a new job. I practically lived in the back lot of the building, utilizing forgotten employee parking spaces. My boss appreciated this arrangement, as I was readily available for any shifts. He even allowed me to set up my camper in one of the spaces. I'm not sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us. I rarely dealt with trespassers. A few security guards escorted them away. I was essentially on call, working nearly every day of the week. My boss allowed me to plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office. I usually showered at a friend's apartment or my local gym since the camper lacked a shower. The camper had only a portable toilet, which I didn't want to fill because emptying it is a nasty chore. I used other bathrooms as often as possible. I had a key to the warehouse and could use the bathroom there at any hour. I became friends with the night security guard, who has since become one of my closest allies. The camper was easy to heat in winter with a small electric heater, but summers were challenging without AC. I had to buy a used portable air conditioner to stay comfortable. I earned a lot of overtime pay and learned new skills from my coworkers. Eventually, midway through the year, I was promoted to a supervisory position, earning a better salary than my previous job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare of losing my condo made me realize I needed something more stable for the long term. I searched for a place close to work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home just 2 miles away, managing to negotiate the price down by $10,000. I used nearly all my savings for the down payment and was approved for a home loan. Finally, I could leave the camper behind. There was enough space to park my truck behind the house and set up the camper in the backyard as a backup. Once I settled into my new home, I foolishly bragged about it on social media. My family saw the post, and that's where the real trouble began. A few weeks later, my parents and brother, along with his family, showed up unannounced to tour my house. I hadn't even given them my address, so I was baffled by how they found out where I lived. None of my friends had visited, and no relatives had come by, so I suspected they might have followed me home from work. It wouldn't surprise me at all when I opened the door. They barged in like excited tourists and made themselves at home. They poked around, and my sister-in-law wore a creepy smirk that I later realized was infuriating. My parents kept commenting on how I had so much extra space for someone without a family. My brother remarked that my house had more space than our parents' home and was closer to his job. Red flags were everywhere. Eventually, my brother asked to speak with me privately, and everyone else left the room, which made me realize they had a plan. My brother, whom I'll refer to as Dan for simplicity, suggested that my house was too much for me alone and that I should let him and his family move in. He pointed out that his wife was pregnant with their 4th child and that my house was closer to his job. He mentioned that I already had the camper, so I could live in that while they occupied the main house. Not once did he offer to pay rent. He also started discussing changes in curfews, insisting I couldn't just walk in without prior notice. That if it weren't my brother, I would have thought he had lost his mind. But Dan had long since lost his marbles due to our parents treating him like the center of the universe. I tried to speak, but he kept interrupting me, as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way I would rent my house or any part of it to him. I might consider renting to others to help with the mortgage, but not him or his awful wife. I had seen similar situations in videos online, but I never thought I would experience it myself. So I picked up my phone and started recording. Dan didn't seem to notice and continued to ramble about why he needed my house. He even acted like it was a done deal and reached out to shake my hand. That was when I finally stood my ground and said, "Hell no!" I raised my voice enough to catch him off guard. I had rarely raised my voice to him before because of our parents' punishments. But this was my house, not theirs. I told him that my house was not up for grabs, and that acting like I would let him move in wouldn't make it happen. I had worked hard to buy my house, and I deserved it. Dan got physically close to me without touching, and insisted I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family. I laughed in his face and told him that was complete nonsense. He yelled that I had no wife or kids and didn't need all the space, so I might as well give it to him. I reiterated that I wasn't giving him anything, especially since he never offered to pay rent. I would still be responsible for the entire mortgage without being able to live in my own home. Dan insisted he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family came first. Then my parents told my brother to take my house because I don't have a family. They broke my locks to move in while I wasn't home after I kicked my parents, brother, and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house. I immediately went to social media to share my story with the family. It spread quickly, but you won't find it now because it was deleted, and I put my profile on private. I posted about it because I knew my family would twist the event to make me the villain. I had about an hour to get my side out before they could respond, and I had video evidence to back up my claims. No, I don't plan on showing the video here, so please don't ask. Being proactive worked. I gained support from several family members right away. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law must have been ready to write their own posts. But it was too late, so they didn't bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan, and sister-in-law had a few supporters, but not many, as plenty of others were aware of their entitled behavior. What happened next was something they quickly understood and accepted. One person called me, ranting that I was a horrible brother and needed to make way for a real family man. I ended the call and blocked the number. That was the last I heard from them for a week. My parents showed up at my front porch with Dan, just like they said they would in their previous ultimatum. They rang the doorbell incessantly and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to push their way in again. I had installed latch chains to prevent them from entering and braced my body against the door. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I told them I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and, in her sickly sweet tone, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told them to F off and never come back. My mother put on crocodile tears, asking why I couldn't just do this for Dan, my beloved brother. I laughed and bluntly stated that I didn't love him as a brother because he had treated me poorly for years, and they had only encouraged him. They were terrible parents, and he was a terrible brother. I told them to leave or I'd call the police immediately. Surprisingly, they left easily, apart from my mother's loud crying and the dirty looks from the others. It was suspiciously easy to make them leave. I thought the mess was over, but I should have taken them more seriously because they had other ridiculous plans. Later that week, I came home on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family moving in. He waved at me with a smug grin when I saw him. I was furious and told them to stop, but sister-in-law smugly said they were moving in, like it or not. Then, in a fake tone while tilting her head and pouting, she said it was okay because my mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I was seething with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug face, so I locked myself in my truck to call the police. When they realized what I was doing, sister-in-law started pounding on my window, yelling that I couldn't do this to her because she and Dan needed the house. She cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded with, "F Dan. It's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key my truck unless I stopped calling the police, which the 911 operator heard thanks to the window being slightly open. I told sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she retreated when the police arrived. Dan and sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I explained the situation to the cops and showed them my new driver's license with my current address. When we reached my front door, I saw they had changed the lock, and the old one was lying on the porch with the center drilled out. The drill they used was right next to it, along with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been any more foolish to leave evidence like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown of the events leading up to this. I guess Dan called our parents after I arrived home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied, claiming I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I told them that was an easily provable lie. Dan and sister-in-law finally emerged from my house with some papers in hand, looking smug as if they had outsmarted me. They had drawn up a fake rental agreement, but my signature was nowhere to be found. The one they had looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them had ever seen my signature, so that was incredibly foolish on their part. I told my parents and Dan that this was blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure it out. I didn't think going to jail would do them any good. It could even cost Dan his job. I also mentioned I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I would call CPS for good measure. Dan went pale when I said that, but my mother stepped in and insisted I should just do this for Dan and live in the camper. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let him have her house instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I warned them to leave or I'd press charges. I stated loudly that they had drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obvious fakes. They had forged my signature badly, and I had recorded video evidence of sister-in-law attacking me. Those were felonies that could ruin their lives if I chose to pursue it, and if they didn't leave, that was exactly what I would do. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. She then spoke quietly with sister-in-law while my father talked to Dan's sister-in-law, began loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits, tossing them like confetti. An officer told them to pick up the bits of paper or he'd cite them for littering. The cops had a, "I don't get paid enough for this" look on their faces. Dan had to instruct his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest sobbed that he wouldn't get his own room now. Sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids to make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with a sad family routine, the kind where they all gather together in a group hug while facing one direction. I swear they must have practiced it beforehand. All the kids had the same pleading look, and sister-in-law rubbed her pregnant belly while tilting her head like a sad puppy. My brother just made the saddest face he could muster and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here," but I didn't waver and told them to keep packing. The kids and sister-in-law cranked up the crying, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I laughed maniacally and pointed out that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing. No amount of crying would make me let his family move in because he was no brother of mine anymore. He was just an entitled jerk who thought he could take whatever he wanted from me. Dan started cursing at me until the cops told him to cool it. He looked a mix of afraid and furious. I asked the cops if they could stay until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left, and they assured me they wouldn't go anywhere until the situation was resolved. In the next few minutes, 2 more police cars arrived, bringing the total to 4. For whatever reason, this seemed to motivate my parents to leave. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he had put on my front door, but I planned to change it the next day. I didn't know if he had copies of the keys, and he was reluctant to hand them over. Instead of giving them to me, he threw them down the street into a storm drain, telling me to retrieve them myself. One of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off to retrieve them, getting dirty in the process. When he returned the keys, he grumbled and slammed them into my hand. I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother threatened to disown me for this. As if that were a threat, I sarcastically replied, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you where I always get treated like crap by you all anyway because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. You treated me so poorly growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So I told them to do what they always advised me to do when I was mistreated and suck it up." Final update. My parents told my brother to take my house because I don't have a family. I decided to wait until after the new year to create an account and post, just in case more events unfolded, and they did. As previous readers know, my sister-in-law was making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were clearly aimed at me, especially after she had her 4th baby in November. She kept repeating the same complaints, finding clever ways to reword them, but it was the same tired narrative about needing her own space. I know I sound dismissive, but after living through what I have with these people, you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins for them too. They're just that unbearable. Since I waited until January to create an account, more events unfolded, just as I suspected that I had invited half the family to a Christmas Eve party at my house, and everyone I invited showed up, despite the long drive of 3 to 4 hours. They wanted to come and support me, praising my hard work in securing my home and expressing their sympathy for everything I had endured. They asked why I didn't just take my camper and drive back to them instead of living nearly homeless for so long. I sheepishly admitted that I was attached to my area and had the best job opportunities here. My hometown didn't offer many good jobs in my field, if any at all, and I wanted to forge my own path. They accepted my explanation, and we moved on to enjoy a lovely party, the best I'd had in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, and I must say my uncle's Ray Charles collection was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else. It was a grand and joyful occasion, allowing me to forget my past issues and enjoy the moment. However, I wouldn't be sharing this if it had remained that way. About 2 hours into the party, guess who showed up? My parents, brother, and sister-in-law barged in, trying to appear cheerful. They didn't even knock. They just walked right through my front door as if they belonged there. I turned off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay, claiming they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and yelled at them before I could speak, declaring they didn't deserve to be in my home or my life after their previous actions. He was supported by several other relatives. This uncle, my mother's brother, had adored her until he learned about the dynamics between me and my parents. My grandparents, who are quite elderly, intervened and told my parents that if they wanted to reconcile with me, it was far too soon. They expressed their disappointment in my parents for their favoritism towards my brother, which had been hidden for too long. They needed to genuinely treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be part of my life again. They then turned to Dan and sister-in-law, stating they were tired of sister-in-law's repetitive complaints and that my house would not become their new home. Sister-in-law reverted to her usual crying and threw a tantrum, insisting she should be the one living here, not me. She plopped down in a chair, whining that it wasn't fair I had this house to myself when I had no family, while she had 4 kids needing more space and just wanted to feel like a real mom. It was petty of me, but I pointed out that she was a terrible mother for allowing my mother to do most of the parenting while she lounged around on her phone or spent Dan's money. I even joked that I was surprised her baby didn't get drunk from her breast milk since she drank so much alcohol, which drew some disapproving stares. Sister-in-law demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom, and I replied that the evidence spoke for itself. If she wanted to afford to move out of my parents' house, she needed to use her college degree, get a job, and learn to save money. My mother already did most of the childcare for my brother's kids, so sister-in-law would have plenty of time once her baby got older. My brother's eldest child, who was 7, ran up and began kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom, insisting I was the bad guy who made her cry and wouldn't let them live here. My brother pulled his son away, but the other relatives jumped in, turning it into a family intervention against my sister-in-law and brother. She was crying, her new baby was crying, her kids were crying. Even Dan was nearly in tears from the verbal onslaught. He sat on the ottoman by the front door, looking utterly defeated. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze and couldn't muster a word to me, not with a house full of angry relatives ready to judge him if he tried to revert to his golden child persona. If they hadn't been there to restrain him, I bet this would have turned into a repeat of when he tried to bully me into giving him my house months earlier. By this point, he had been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputations in the family were in tatters. Soon after, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left in defeat. The party resumed, and we all avoided discussing what had just transpired. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night at my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper to ensure there was enough space. It actually made a decent guest house. My relatives had wanted a tour of the camper earlier, and they were amazed that I had lived in it for nearly 2 years. They asked me all sorts of questions about what summer and winter were like in there. I woke up earlier than everyone else on Christmas morning, brewing a fresh pot of coffee and having some ibuprofen ready for those suffering from eggnog hangovers. I received compliments for being a much better host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After the holiday, sister-in-law finally ceased her passive-aggressive posts aimed at me and deleted the old ones. However, shortly after the new year, She made a new post complaining about how she had tried to convince my parents to get a camper like mine to set up in the backyard so Dan and his family could use my entire house as their family home. While a taste of one's own medicine is never pleasant, my parents firmly rejected that idea. They made it clear that no one was going to push them out of their own home, especially not their master bedroom. The post was only up for a couple of days before sister-in-law removed it, and she has hardly posted anything since. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, does it still complain? Sister-in-law seems to have realized there's no point in complaining when no one is listening, and Dan can't afford to move his family out on his salary anytime soon. If they end up expecting another child in the next few years, I wouldn't be surprised. Things have calmed down for me since then, and I've even invited friends over for poker nights. I may not be great at poker, but we enjoy drinking beer and eating junk food while having a good time. We loaded up on Whoppers from Burger King and had a blast, just enjoying ourselves like grown men do when they want to unwind. I think I might consider dating someone around summer. I'm not getting any younger. Fingers crossed that goes well. My camper now sits idle in my yard, and I admit there are days I go out there just to spend time in it. After living in it for 2 years, it feels like my second home. Maybe one day I'll actually get to use it for camping, as it was intended. I've never been camping. My parents always thought it was a waste of time, so it would be a completely new experience for me. This pretty much wraps up what happened. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law have been keeping their distance from me. In fact, they seem to have reverted to acting like I don't exist, just like before I bought my house. Not that it bothers me. It's better this way, however. I know they'll inevitably return in some capacity. I just wonder what kind of ridiculous antics they'll pull next. If anything noteworthy happens again, I'll be sure to make another post if this account is still active.